Hi everyone, welcome to the first mini-series of the MPA's Sustainability Ambassador Network's Lunchtime and Learn webinar series. My name is George Baker and I work in the Sustainability and Climate Change team at WSP. And we provide management and consultancy service to the built and natural environment. And I shall be chairing the first series run by WSP. So the aim of these webinars is to provide a quick pit stop on some of the engaging sustainability hot topics of today. And we will run one of these a month, and where each will be about 30 minutes long, allowing around 15 minutes for Q&As at the end. You'll be muted during this webinar, so please feel free to send through questions in the comments section, and we will try to address as many of these as possible in the Q&A at the end. This will also be very interactive, so do open menti.com on your smartphone or browser and use the Menti code display on the screen. So today's webinar will be run by Mike Hardisty on net zero, carbon neutral and science-based GHGs. Mike leads WSP UK's infrastructure carbon footprint service and also manages our corporate GHG emissions reporting. WSP UK has committed to being carbon neutral by 2025, and Mike has developed both the carbon management plan and carbon offsetting plan for this, and is now supporting the development of the company's net zero strategy. As a consultant, Mike has led carbon footprints of diverse activities such as rail and highways engineering projects, and Mike's work on the Great Western Electrification Programme led to WSP being finalists in the EDI Sustainability Leaders Award 2017, the NECE 100 Awards, and also won the Client Network Rail and Green Apple Award. So without further ado, I shall pass you over to the safe hands of our carbon guru, Mike, to talk you through the latest on net zero and carbon neutrality.
Thanks everyone for joining. I'm sat at home, whereas Taylor is sat in another office and is actually going to drive the slides, both the slides that we're looking at now, and we've also got some interactive Menti questions to make sure this is a bit more of a to and fro between me and you, the audience. So Taylor, if you could flick onto the next PowerPoint slide for me, please. Thanks. So we'll be covering the three topics there: carbon neutral, net zero, and science-based targets as advertised. We'll also be taking deeper dives into a couple of related topics, and those two topics are scope 3 emissions and carbon removal, because we can't really do justice to net zero without discussing those in a bit more detail. And to make sure that Menti is working, I was wondering if you can please open another browser or use your mobile phone to go to menti.com and then enter that 7-digit number that you can see. And Taylor, if you can, in a couple of seconds, once people have scribbled down that web link and the number 997793 we're going to just ask you to input a little bit of information about yourselves, partly just to check that the system is working. So we already have some people logging in, marvelous, a lot of consultants out there, a lot of public sector and some manufacturing. Good. Okay, well, we'll let that settle down just for a little while before we flick to the next question, which is just a little bit more about your experience. So for those that have filled that in, thank you very much, Taylor. If you can just give an idea of your level of understanding, that helps me pitch this at the right kind of level. So I can explain some of the concepts such as scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 in more detail or less detail. So I guess we've got people somewhere in the middle of limited understanding and good understanding. Okay. Good. All right. Thanks. Letting that settle down. I think, Taylor, if we could flick back to the PowerPoint slides and then go ahead and to the next slide. Wonderful, thank you very much. So for those of you that are members of IEMA, that's the Institute of Environmental Management Assessment, you may have seen this in your Transform magazine back in March 2020, clarifying net zero. Confusion arises when net zero is used synonymously with carbon neutral. Is it? ? So you can flick on to the next slide for me, please, Taylor. And then this just came out in the current version of Transform magazine, which I'm sure you'll read avidly. Many councils, companies and industries have pledged to become net zero or zero carbon, and they might have signed to a pledge to net zero or transform to net zero. And it says that the exact definition of these terms can vary. So quite a lot of confusion out there, but things are beginning to shake down from a net zero point of view, but still people might say, well, I now know what net zero is, but I still don't understand how that's different from carbon neutral. So that's essentially what we're going to try and get to the bottom of on this session. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So I'm just going to do a little canter over carbon neutral because it's a concept that's been around for a little while now, and it's pretty well defined in that it has a something similar to a British standard, a PAS, something called PAS 2060, and we're going to have a little look at that now. Taylor, if you can flick on. So this PAS 2060, which is how to demonstrate that you're carbon neutral, came out in 2014, and it helps organizations define carbon neutrality either for the company or for an event or for a product or a service. And several companies have used it to try and demonstrate and announce that they're carbon neutral, such as Marks and Spencer's. My local Shell garage even entices you to drive carbon neutral, though don't they claim to be PAS 2060 certified. So you can see the PAS includes a definition of what they think carbon neutral means, which is during a specified period, there has been no net increase in the global emissions of GHGs, which means greenhouse gases, as a result of the GHGs associated with the subject. So a fairly dry definition, but let's see then what needs to happen if you are to be a carbon neutral company, for example. Thanks, Taylor. So we start by defining the subject. Is it for a product or a service or the entire company? Is it for just the UK part of the company or global? And then you'll go through what is for many a fairly regular carbon footprinting exercise. So you need to account for all your scope 1 emissions, and by scope 1 essentially we mean fossil fuels that are burnt on your property that you own. So typically this might be in an office environment, boilers that you own to heat the property. Scope 2 emissions, which typically will be electricity, and then a bit of a catch-all here, any scope 1, 2 or 3 emissions source estimated to be material, i.e. greater than 1% of the total footprint. So scope 3 emissions are all the other emissions, and we'll be coming to the next slide, which just hold on a second, will I'll show you what those scope 3 emissions are. So we start by putting a carbon footprint together, basically. Scope 1 and Scope 2, people have been publishing and reporting on for many years. Scope 3 as well, but not as comprehensively. So my next Menti question, which is Menti question 3, is how many Scope 3 categories are there according to the GHG protocol? Very good. Settling down. Okay, so the consensus is around 10 or 12 Scope 3 emission categories. Okay, all right. Reasonable guesses. Taylor, if you can flick back to the PowerPoint and move on to the next slide, which shows the greenhouse gas protocol's view of scope 3. So you can see there's actually 15. Anybody got 15? Pat on the back, of which 8 are upstream and 7 are downstream. So very often the scope 3s that a lot of companies will publish carbon footprint for is business travel, maybe waste, perhaps employee commuting, and the others are less well reported, and downstream less well reported again. So IKEA and Microsoft have been reporting their use of sold products, but they are kind of in the minority for doing that. And part of the reason for that is that when the GHG protocol was first published, which I think was around 2004, that kind of time, scope 3 was actually seen as optional. So a bit like the carbon, the PAS standard, where you had to do all your scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 3 was optional at the time. It's no longer the case, but I think it's, you know, that sort of built in a bit of a lag that companies are less inclined to publish their scope 3s. So that brings me on to the next Menti question, which is, which scope 3 categories does your organization currently publish or report on? Now, I haven't put all of them in there, but there's a good cross section of upstream, and then I've lumped all the downstream together in the right hand bucket, if you like. Good. Business travel is one of the most commonly reported, and waste. Many have to report on their waste anyway, so they have the data to hand for that. So hence waste is quite high. Employee commuting looks like it's coming out of the next highest, which is good to see, because that's obviously, often quite large, and often doesn't go well reported. Good. Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, business travel always comes out pretty high, I guess, because travel firms can often provide decent data on that too. Okay, could we flick back to the PowerPoint, please, and yeah, move on to the next slide. So having put your carbon footprint together, which you do normally just by multiplying activity data, so that might be the kilowatts hours or the miles driven by an emission factor for your electricity or for your gas or for your mode of transport, you get your emissions footprint. And then you need to develop a carbon management plan to demonstrate how you're going to reduce your emissions, and monitor those emissions and set targets, which can either be an absolute emissions target or an intensity emissions target. So the absolute there is tons of CO2, but an emissions intensity might be tons of CO2 per full-time equivalent or per $1 million turnover, whatever it might be. Okay. It doesn't critically, I might just point out here that the PAS doesn't specify what carbon reduction targets need to be set. So it doesn't say, 10% or 50% or whatever. That's not in the PAS. Right, if you could flick to the next slide, please, Taylor. So finally, the organization makes carbon reductions, and assuming that it can't reduce the carbon emissions to zero, which very few will be able to do, they need to purchase carbon offsets to cover those residual emissions, whatever's left. So as an example, Marks and Spencer's self-certified to PAS 2060. They publish an annual statement saying what their emissions were and what scope, and they bought 158,000 tons of carbon credits over the period 2018 to 2019. So in buying offsets, there is quite a difference between those offsets on the market. And I just took some examples from the United Nations carbon offset platform there. Anything from hydropower to cooking stoves. But the one that I've highlighted in red is, to me, quite different from the others, because the one in red is actually going to remove carbon from the atmosphere, reforestation, afforestation, but the others look to avoid emissions being pumped into the atmosphere in the first place. So if you're putting up a wind turbine, that's avoiding, say, a coal and oil or a gas-fired power station emitting emissions, but it won't actually take any emissions out of the atmosphere. And this is a bit of a key point when we come to talk about net zero, which we're going to do in a second. But just to point out that from a carbon neutral point of view, there's no distinction between avoidance offsets and removals offsets. Okay, flicking over to the next slide then, please. So following the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees, which was I think 2015's ratified in 2016 or thereabouts, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued a special report in 2018 about how the world might limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C and the advantages of doing that rather than well below 2 degrees C. And it modeled pathways which, if you want to have limited overshoot of 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise, or no overshoot of that temperature rise, then global CO2 emissions had to decline to net zero by around 2050. So that's where this 2050, which is often talked about, comes from, and the net zero issue. So off the back of that, so that came out in 2018. If we could flick over to the next slide, please. And then in the UK in 2019, the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, published its assessment of reducing UK emissions to net zero by 2050. And it includes its definition of net zero there. So emissions means that the total of active removals from the atmosphere offsets any remaining emissions from the rest of the economy. So the idea is that we will shrink our emissions as far as we can to 2050, but there is bound to be some remaining emissions which must be offset. So it says under the little brown barrels on the right-hand side. And those remaining emissions are largely coming from aviation, which is about a third of the remaining emissions, and agriculture, which is about another third of the remaining emissions. And we'll cover how those emissions might be removed from the atmosphere a little bit later in the presentation. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So I think that I said that report came out in 2019. I think it was early in 2019, and then off the back of that, in middle of 2019, the UK government changed its commitment to become a net zero economy by 2050, and you can see that that's in line with France and New Zealand. I think the EU is working on a similar ambition, but other countries have gone for earlier targets. Okay, flicking to the next slide. Thank you very much. And there was a lot of activity last year with many local authorities. I think there's in excess of 60 or even 70% of local authorities have now committed to being net zero. But you can see lots of different timescales. So 2030 is quite a typical one, a few 2050. Oxfordshire, very ambitious at 2020. And given that we didn't really have an agreed definition of what net zero meant at a corporate or organizational level, which we are now getting close to having one, and I'll cover that in a minute. Presumably, many of the local authorities had slightly different definitions of what was how they defined net zero and what was in scope and what wasn't in scope and that kind of thing. But no doubt we will all align in due course. And the next slide, please. So here's another pledge to net zero, which was launched, I think, last year, mainly at the environment sector. I think the Society for Environment is behind this, as is IEMA. Many people have signed up, organizations have signed up to this. So there's, on signing up, at the time, the target was 1.5 or well below 2 degrees C carbon reduction scenario was required, and the scope was buildings and business travel. Flicking to the next slide, please. And although buildings aren't really my area, just to make you aware that the Green Building Council has put together its definition of what a net zero building looks like, and the fact that it covers both the construction of the building and the operation of the building as well. And as you can see, offsetting of remaining carbon at the bottom there. Okay, and the next slide, please. But what we were those in the sustainability team here at WSP anyway were very excited about was this new document which came out just last month, September, published by the highly respected Science-Based Targets Initiative, called Foundations for Science-Based Net Zero Target Setting in the Corporate Sector. So this is just the beginning of a definition of what it means to be net zero as a corporate or as an organization, and there's going to be further guidance coming out next year. I think they're looking to publish draft guidance before Christmas, and then I think next year it'll become firmed up. But it's got a very useful definition there. So firstly, we need to achieve value chain emission reductions consistent with limiting warming to 1.5. And then we need to neutralize any residual emissions by permanently removing an equivalent amount of CO2. So those three points which I've highlighted in red are absolutely key, and I'm going to dive into each of those separately in the next in the remainder of the slide deck, basically. But just to say that we need, whilst it talks about CO2 there, actually the net zero target's going to cover all GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon dioxide. As many of you will know, we need to convert greenhouse gas emissions into a carbon dioxide equivalent. But then when it comes to removing, at the moment, we can only really remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, not some of the other greenhouse gases such as methane, or if we can, then the technology might not be as mature as those for carbon dioxide, which is why I just talked about carbon dioxide for the emissions removal. Okay, so going to the next slide then, please. So as I said, we're going to drill into those three areas: the 1.5 degree science-based targets, the value chain, and the GHG removals or offsets. And I'll take the science-based targets first. If you could flick over to the next slide. So Science-Based Target Initiative was established back in 2015, so not that long ago, to answer the question, what reduction target would support at the time 2 degrees centigrade warming? That was back in the day when that was considered a safe limit to global warming. And essentially it looked at what carbon or the amount of greenhouse gases that could be emitted over the next decades, and looked at what sectors would be emitting those greenhouse gases, and then tried to plot a reduction path broken down by the different sectors. So it's got some very prestigious organizations behind it, such as the World Resources Institute, which was also one of the backers of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Carbon Disclosure Project, now known as the CDP. And it's HQ'd in Washington, DC. So I'm sure Trump gives it a very generous write-up. So flicking onto the next slide, please. So I just mentioned that it looks at the world very often through different sectors, and in fact it's developed something called a sectorial decarbonisation approach as one of its main methods. So it might take a sector such as iron and steel or cement or power and look at the trajectory that sector needs to decline by to 2050, and that's the left-hand graph that you're looking at there, and the black line is represented as the sector. So if you're company A and you're much higher than average, then your reduction needs to be steeper, and if you're company C and you're actually your emissions intensity is lower than average, then your reduction doesn't have to be quite so tough. And then there's the absolute contraction. So not all sectors are covered by the SDA approach. So there's also the absolute contraction, which is more of a straight line approach to reducing your emissions. And you could see that back in the day when 2 degrees C was seen as an acceptable level of global warming, the reduction required was about 1.2% per annum. To hit well below 2 degrees C is about 2.5, so about double that. And then to hit 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming, then we're looking at around about 4% per annum, which over 12 years is about 50%. So if you think of halving your carbon emissions over a 12-year period. Right, next slide, please. Sorry, you've just, yeah, that's okay. I forgot there was a little animation in there. Next slide, all the same. Okay, so that was a quick counter through the science-based targets. We'll now look at what we mean by the value chain. Next slide, please. So the value chain is really your scope 1, your scope 2, and all your upstream scope 3 emissions and all your downstream scope 3 emissions. There's quite a lot to go at. There are the 15 that I showed you just earlier. Could we go to Menti and ask the next question, just while I put my Skype on mute because someone's trying to Skype me. 1 second. Okay, so this question is, which areas of your value chain contribute the most emissions? And if you could just let me know your organization type and what the source is. Doesn't have to be the scope number, but just, yeah, as you're doing, just business travel or use of sold products or whatever it might be. Great. Well, I guess this is good that business travel is coming up as a what you consider to be one of your hotspots, given that you're publishing and reporting on it so widely. So that's good news. At least that's consistent. Business travel and consulting. Yep. Yeah, for us, business travel is much larger than our offices. This is at WSP UK, but commuting is significant too. Good. construction, purchase goods and services. Yep. That's where I do a lot of my work in the embodied carbon associated with steel and concrete and aluminium and asphalt and all that. All those construction materials. It's big and beginning to get the attention it needs. Okay, let's move on then. Could you move to back to the presentation and flick on to the next one, and that's this is our last but one Menti question, which is which scope 3 emissions should your organization be responsible for offsetting? Remembering that that diagram of upstream business travel, commuting, all that, and downstream is more to do with the services and products sold. So if you could flick back to Menti, please, Taylor, and let's just see how those questions are coming in for question 6. Oh, where is question 6? It's gone. There we go. Thank you. There we are. Thank you. So upstream and downstream, upstream only, or don't know, it depends. And bear in mind, we don't yet have the guidance on this from the Science Based Targets organization. It'll be really interesting to see just what their assumption is about the downstream emissions. I think upstream we can take as read, that we will probably all need to offset those, but it'd be very interesting just to see what they say about downstream. Okay, thanks a lot. Let's flick back then to the presentation and flick onto the next slide, please. And I just thought this was quite an interesting graph. It's slightly off topic, but you can see that this comes from the UN Environment Programme's emissions gap report, and you can see the difference between the emissions which are produced within the territory, if you like, which is the thick line, and then the emissions which come in from abroad due to imports and consumption. So you can see the Europe is reducing its emissions, generally speaking, but we don't want to forget that some of those emissions are coming in from outside the territory, and the same with America. In fact, America's out of territory appears to be increasing, and of course, where's that coming from? Well, largely China. So we might be reducing our territorial carbon footprint, but we need to take account of our country's value chain, if you like, by including the stuff which is coming in from abroad. Okay, next slide, please. So lastly, let's look at GHG removals, or really, I guess, CO2 removals and offsets. Next slide. So we all know where the emissions are coming from. It's from our offices and our factories and our travel. And I've put that slide up about the UN's offset program, which showed some of the ways that emissions can be avoided. So there were a lot of cooking stove projects in there. There was a wind farm, and there's probably some solar voltaics in there. So that all prevents emissions from escaping into the atmosphere. And very often that is true for carbon capture and storage. So if we had a steel plant, for example, which invested in carbon capture and storage, that would just stop the emissions associated with the steel plant escaping into the atmosphere. Then to the right, we've got emissions removal, which is actually sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So afforestation and reforestation was on the UN offset program. So that's the tree on the left. But as we'll see in a moment, there's going to be a lot of attention given to something called BECCS, which is bioenergy with CCS, carbon capture and storage. So that's growing the biomass, the trees, whatever it might be, which sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere, but then we might burn that to generate electricity, for example, but rather than letting those emissions go out into the atmosphere, we trap them in as part of CCS. And then there's DAC, which is direct air capture, and that also needs to have carbon capture and storage. So this is, I've put some, I think it's actually pizza wheels there, but it's supposed to show what a direct air capture looks like, which is lots and lots of fans. I think there's a chemical process which sucks the CO2 out of the air, and then the air travels on its merry way. But obviously all that captured CO2 has got to be stored somewhere so it doesn't get out again. So that's emissions removal. Next slide, please. And just for a bit of fun, I thought I would try and estimate how much, what area would be needed to offset by tree planting the emissions which are likely to be still coming from the UK in 2050. So these figures have come from the Committee on Climate Change. So we're currently around about 435 megatons per annum, and by 2050 it should be down at about 90. Now, bearing in mind that you have to plant a hectare of trees to take 350 tons out of the atmosphere, and those trees have got to be left there for 80-100 years to let them grow to full maturity and take as much carbon out of the atmosphere, carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as possible. So that's the last Menti question for you then. Is what area of Greater London would need to be planted each year to take that 90 megatons out of the atmosphere? I think I've rechecked my calculations here, so I hope I'm right, but be interesting to see what you think. So is it the same size as Greater London, which would be 100%, or is it more than that or less than that?
Thanks, Mike. We've also got about 5 minutes left for questions as well. Some really interesting questions coming through. So yeah,
okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm on the last couple of slides.
Excellent stuff. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks for the prompt. Okay, good. So I reckon it's about 160%, which is why if we go back, and so good estimates there. If we go back to the main slides and move on, which is why you can see that those removals are mainly going to be done by BECCS rather than tree planting. Okay, right, next slide, please. And you can see that there's a great differential between those three modes of carbon removal at the moment, and I would expect the BECCS and the DACs to come down, and probably the tree planting to increase. Right, next slide, please. Thanks. So I've just tried to summarize here what I see as the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. You can be carbon neutral now if you just buy enough offsets, whereas net zero is more of a medium and long-term ambition. I think the scope is roughly the same. The reduction target is definitely different. The net zero, you have to have 1.5 degree science-based targets, but carbon neutral, there is no required target. And in net zero, you have to reduce your absolute emissions, whereas carbon neutral could be absolute or intensity. And the offsets for net zero must be removal offsets, whereas for carbon neutral, it could be avoidance or removal. Last slide. Thanks. It'd just be a bit remiss of me, given that this is the Major Projects Association, not to mention PAS 2080, which is a guide on how to manage carbon in major infrastructure projects. and has this handy little carbon reduction hierarchy to the right, which, given the time we've got, I won't go through, but it's probably a subject of a separate presentation. I am done. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry for going on a little bit. I know we haven't got much time for questions, but I'll happily try and take questions if you have any.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mike, and a brilliant presentation. Quite timely now that also I think solar is the cheapest electricity in history as of today or this week. So really interesting stuff. We haven't got time to go through all the questions. So what I'll do is we'll send the recording out of this. So you can either get in touch with Mike, and I'll also try and send directly some responses for the questions. But just to go straight into them, and we'll try and get through a couple. So Mike, one of the first questions, with many of us working from home now, should working from home emissions be included in the Scope 3 emissions in the value chain? And should this be part of the annual carbon report?
Good question. Yeah, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Scope 3 guidance actually has it as an optional part of the reporting, but bear in mind that was put together before anybody had heard of COVID-19. So I think it should be included if you've got substantial numbers of people working from home, and we WSP are in the throes of updating our annual commuting survey, where we try and estimate our carbon emissions for commuting to also include working from home. It'd be interesting just to see how significant that is, but I think it can't be ignored if these working arrangements become permanent. Thanks, George.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. Yeah, we've got another one here about sort of the offsetting side of things. So how are offsetting costs likely to change in the future? I presume that's also to do with pricing as well.
Yeah, good question. I think they are, yes, I suggested that they're likely to change. I think the cost of just growing trees, especially in Europe or the populated countries of Europe, such as the UK, will steadily increase as both demand increases because everybody's going net zero and needs to offset, but also as space begins, sort of free space begins to decline, it suggests that prices will increase, whereas the technology behind BECCS, let's hope, will see cost reductions. So a bit like photovoltaics and wind farms, you know, when it was very expensive, but now it's getting cheaper and cheaper. So at one point they'll cross over, and BECCS will become the go-to, which presumably is why the Committee on Climate Change has assumed that we're going to be mainly looking at BECCS by 2050.
Brilliant. And then our final question, just before we wrap up, and yeah, we'll keep it fairly straightforward. So this one is: how can we assure all our net zero targets and measurements are aligned? Is there a common framework? I presume the race to zero can be one, but yeah.
That's very good. Yeah, I think it's going to, everybody will start to go towards the science-based targets net zero definition. So we've now got the beginnings of a definition. That, you know, it has to be value chain, it's got to be removals, it's got to be 1.5 degrees C. What we don't yet know is the sort of the nitty gritty about, okay, you say value chain, but in this industry or in that sector, exactly how far down the value chain are you expecting us to go? Brilliant. So I think that's going to be the tricky one.
Excellent stuff. Well, if we go on to the final slide, and I just sort of say a big thank you to everyone who's joined today, and just to let you know that we have a couple more lined up. So we're doing, like I said at the start, sort of one a month. So our next one's on the 5th of November, and that's looking at sort of the lockdown learnings, particularly for sustainability leaders. And that'll be David Simons, our head of UK sustainability, who will be leading on that one. And then on the 2nd of December, we've got measuring and reporting your greenhouse gas emissions. So James Tapson will be covering the new UK mandatory reporting, SECR, and the ins and outs in that, and sort of simplifying it as much as possible. And then going forward in the new year, we've got ACOM taking on the mini-series. So yeah, I just want to say again a big thank you also to the Major Projects Association for hosting these, and yeah, hopefully, and thank you to Mike as well, and hopefully to see you all at the next one. Thanks very much.